Good morning, everybody. This is Paul Salem. I'm the president of the Middle East Institute here in Washington, D.C. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's event. I'm delighted to speak with Dr. Phil Gordon about his new book, Losing the Long Game, The False Promise of Regime Change in the Middle East, available from St. Martin's Press. And Phil's book was just reviewed today in the New York Times, and it's been reviewed many other places as well. In his new book, Phil examines the history of U.S. intervention in the Middle East and explores the reasons why attempts at regime change have nearly all failed. Ahead of elections in the U.S. and uncertain futures in many countries in the Middle East and North Africa region, the lessons from this book are particularly relevant. Let me introduce Phil. Dr. Gordon is the Mary and David Boies Senior Fellow in U.S. Foreign Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. He was Special Assistant to President Obama and was the White House Coordinator for the Middle East, North Africa, and the Gulf region from 2013 to 2015. He worked closely with the President, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor on issues including the Iranian nuclear program, Middle East peace talks, the conflict in Syria, the situation in Iraq, U.S. relations with the Gulf, the Libya crisis, and many, many other issues. Before that, he served in the Clinton administration, the Bill Clinton administration, from 1998 to 1999 as the Director of European Affairs. I look forward to taking, I think, Phil, if I'm not mistaken, you're also Senior Advisor to the Albright Stonebridge Group. Phil, it's great to have you with us this morning, and thanks for taking the time. I look forward to taking audience questions through the Zoom's Q&A feature, so please use that at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There are too many attendees to sort of do it by voice, so just send your questions on the Q&A feature, and I will weave them into the conversation with Dr. Gordon. For those calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream, you can ask a question by email, and just email events@mei.edu. If you have any technical issues, also send an email to the same email, events@mei.edu. So feel free to ask a question anytime throughout the event. I'll be looking for your questions and factor as many in as possible. Let's get started. Phil, great to see you again, and thanks for taking the time. Thanks for writing the book. Let me start with an open question. You've been in this business a long time. You've written a number of books. Why has this issue seized you in this way? Why did you decide to focus on it? And in 2020 and 2021, who's the intended audience? Who still believes in regime change, I suppose?
Thanks, Paul. First of all, thanks for having me. I remember we first talked about doing something at MEI a long time ago in the early stages of this project, and I was going to take full advantage of your institute's expertise. And now, post-COVID, for better or for worse, the book exists, but I look forward to now presenting the conclusions and discussing it with your team. Why did I write the book now? As you say, many of us have been thinking about this issue for a long time. So what's new about this and what inspired me? More than anything, the answer is that as I watched the Trump administration over the past couple of years formulate its Iran policy, which isn't officially regime change, right? The official policy is just to change Iranian behavior. But I noticed that in reality, it seemed designed to bring about the elimination of a regime and putting something better in place. Pulling out of the Iran nuclear deal, setting conditions that were demands that were almost designed to be rejected, surrounding himself with public advocates of regime change who have long said the only way to fix that problem is regime change in Iran. It led me to think, before we go down that path again, we've been down it before, it'd be kind of interesting to look back at past cases where we tried this or did it in the region and how they turned out. So that's really what the book is. And you ask, like, who is that targeted to? It's to all of us. It's to those who are currently advocating regime change in Iran or anywhere else, Cuba, Venezuela. It's not just in the region, but it's sort of a message to those people and those who would listen to them, i.e. us, American citizens, sort of saying the next time somebody proposes that we can deal with a hard problem in international relations by getting rid of the regime and putting a better one in place, think a little bit about how we've done that before and how it turned out before you embrace that goal. And so that's what I set out to do, is look back at previous cases of regime change in the Middle East. It turns out this is not such a rare occurrence. We've done it on the average of about once a decade for the past 70 years, going back, as I do in the book, all the way to 1953, where the first example here, ironically in Iran, is when the CIA gets behind a coup to get rid of the Iranian prime minister and put in place the Shah. And then there's Afghanistan, which I include of a discussion of the Middle East, where we did it twice, against the Soviet-backed government in the 80s by supporting the Mujahideen, and then against the Taliban after 9/11 in 2001. And then, and this is another part of the answer to the question about why I wrote this, then interestingly, you get the Obama administration, in which I served, as you noted, and we also undertake versions of regime change. In Egypt, Libya, and Syria, we set out in very different ways to push governments out and try to put something better in their place. So, and I'm sure we'll examine each of these in more detail, but the broad thrust and what I found in looking at this history of interventions in the Middle East with the purpose of getting rid of the regime is that for all of their differences, and they're very different, we did it for so many different reasons and so many different ways, for all of their differences, there's some pretty striking patterns. And in every case, the bottom line is we failed to achieve the ultimate objectives that we were pursuing. The costs always turned out to be far more than we imagined, or at least than proponents imagined, never the other way around. And in every case, there were a whole range of unintended consequences. So all of that is to say, before we do that again, let's keep the history in mind and maybe learn from it.
Okay, let me ask a question. I mean, these 5 cases, and sort of unpack a bit. It seems to me, in the case of, let's say, Iran and Egypt, and you could imagine, other coups or events in other parts of the world, that you had a state which is surviving, but there's a change at the top. Take out one leader, one way or another, and put in another, and maybe you can call that regime change. Then you have the cases of Iraq and Libya and Afghanistan and potentially Syria, which are really state change. In other words, the whole state is either collapses or is dismantled. And then you're dealing with a failed state, a disintegrated national polity. It's a completely different animal.
Right.
And yet we call them both regime change. So I want to unpack a bit. And if you look at the Iran case, a horrible case of the US intervening in another country's destiny. But, a cynic would say, well, it held for 26 years and then there was a revolution, 2 generations later. If you look at Egypt, tons of, things you can say and problems, but the Egyptian state is there, life it's very different than countries where a state entirely collapsed. So my question is, and I think there are cases in the Middle East, and I don't have the list of where the CIA staged a coup in Syria in the 1950s, or, there was a very busy time between the Americans and the Russians. But is your argument mainly about state change? I mean, really coming in and building another state, which was attempted in Iraq, which was needed in Libya because Gaddafi didn't have a state. Is that really the high point, whereas horrible coups, might still sadly work if there's a strong state to inherit that coup?
So as you say, there's a lot to unpack there, but I'm glad you sort of brought up this definitional thing. What are we talking about? Because as I said at the start, these cases are all very different. So that gives me the opportunity to be precise in my definition of what I'm talking about. When I talk about regime change, I am talking about cases in which the United States, as a matter of policy, decides that it wants to get rid of not just the government in a country, but essentially to transform the political system and put something else in place. So I don't include cases where we just put our thumb on the scale to have one leader rather than another leader within a political system. That we do from time to time quietly, but that's not really regime change. And I also only include cases, I'm talking about when we actively take measures to bring it about. And you mentioned, for example, because you're an expert, CIA planning for a coup in Syria in the late 50s. That's true, but they were plans, they were on the shelf, and nobody ever did anything with them, really. So I'm talking about cases where we just set out for whatever reason and decide this government and whole system is so problematic that we're going to get rid of it. And you're also right to underscore, are we mixing apples and oranges when we say, a coup in one country, but an invasion and occupation of another? Yes, in a way, but that's what is so striking about this, is that no matter how different the reasons for the intervention or the methods pursued, the patterns are very similar, in fact, strikingly similar. So again, as I underscore, the motivation for Iran in the 50s was Cold War geopolitics and anti-nationalism. In other cases, in the 1980s Afghanistan was the Cold War struggle against the Soviet Union. In Iraq, you had considerations of weapons of mass destruction, terrorism, and repression. In Libya, it was mostly about just saving lives. So you get a whole, in Egypt, it was trying to bring about democracy and siding with the people. So the motivations are all very different. And then the methods are even more different. In some cases, it's just support to the opposition. In some cases, it's a full-out invasion and occupation. In some cases, just diplomacy. So Egypt, in that case, is very different from Iraq. And yet, the result, when it creates a political vacuum by getting rid of that regime, and that's what they all have in common, is by getting rid of the regime and the institutions, you get a security vacuum and a political vacuum. And that's what's similar about all of them. Because in every case, when you get that vacuum, different parties within the country compete for power. Outside actors compete for power. And the United States is left with this dilemma, which we've yet been able to solve, of how we put something more stable in place once we have overthrown whatever was there before we intervened.
Let me loop in a question from our good friend Bill Lawrence, and also something I was thinking about. He mentions obviously the Arab Spring, Arab uprisings, and so I mean, one way to look at it is if you look at much of the Arab public from 2011 up to yesterday in Iraq and Lebanon and Sudan, Algeria. One of the the popular cry of the Arab uprising was the people want to change the regime. الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام. In a sense, obviously they don't mean foreign intervention or anything like that.
Yeah.
And I know that was a big dilemma for you in the Obama administration, that the people, of course, the people is a broad generalization, but you can say that a bulk of the Arab younger generation is not happy with these regimes and wants to change them or wants to bring change to them. And hence, in a sense, they do want regime change. Many of them want that. Now, describe a bit, I mean, we all know that created a dilemma for President Obama, who said we must be on the right side of history. But we tried Egypt, we tried Libya, we tried this. But the question still stands. In other words, if a country is in the throes of a struggle over the future of a state and a regime, and the U.S. has influence, what would your policy recommendation be if the people want domestic regime change? To be clear, nobody wants foreign regime change. Mm-hmm. But does the U.S. stand back and say it's too messy? One could say that was the example in Syria. I mean, you mentioned it in your book, in that famous Politico article, which still kind of takes me aback to this day, that we tried everything in Iraq, it failed. We tried something in Libya, it failed. We tried nothing in Syria. But still, it is a region undergoing change, and a lot of people want the change. And isn't the U.S. part of some form of change? But how do you do it in the right way? And Bill Lawrence mentions there was regime change in Tunisia. It was domestic. It worked. Is that a lesson? What do we take away from this?
So again, a lot of interesting things in that set of questions. And we do precise the Politico quote that you're talking about is relevant to all of this. And I talk about it in the book, which is that this is in terms of the different ways of doing it. In Iraq, we intervened and occupied, and it was a costly disaster. In Libya, we intervened and didn't occupy, and it was a costly disaster. And in Syria, I say we didn't intervene. It was also a costly disaster. Of course, in Syria, we did intervene, but we can get to that. You're right also to underscore, what's interesting about the Obama episode, and it's one reason I wanted to write about this. There was a great irony in all this, right? Because Barack Obama, if anything, got elected to the degree that foreign policy played a role because of his opposition to regime change. In the primaries against Hillary Clinton, he had opposed the Iraq War. This is 2008, when it's seen as a disaster by the American public and is, costing $100 billion a year, and Americans are dying left and right in Iraq, as are obviously Iraqis. Obama opposed it, Hillary Clinton supported it, and he beat her in the primaries. In the general election, John McCain supported the Iraq invasion and the surge of troops. Obama beat him. There were other factors, but to a large degree, Barack Obama really benefited from the fact that in 2002, as an unknown state senator in Illinois, he made a speech saying, I don't oppose all wars, I just oppose dumb wars. And he explained why this was a bad idea. So how does this guy, who is instinctively anti-interventionist, wants to pivot American attention to Asia and do nation building at home, find himself pursuing democracy promotion and regime change in the Middle East? The answer is that in each case, we were sort of pulled in, that even Barack Obama came to the view, maybe we can actually help this positive transformation in each of those cases. But the tragedy of it all is that even with the best of intentions, in each of the cases that we're talking about, we were unable to do it, as different as they were. And Egypt, was an ally and a partner rather than adversary, and all we did was do diplomacy. But we did, at a certain point, come out and say Mubarak must go. In Libya, we used military force and got rid of the regime, even though the official mandate wasn't regime change. That's kind of what we did. And in Syria, we supported the opposition. In each of the cases, you have to acknowledge that the outcome left a lot to be desired. In no case did it produce democracy. Egypt, we're now left with a regime that's even more repressive than the one we helped get rid of. Libya, we got rid of a repressive regime, but we essentially have a civil war with outside powers fueling it. And in Syria, we weren't even able to get rid of it. So it's hard to argue that throwing our weight behind regime change in those cases, even with the best of intentions, turned out to be the right policy. And part of the problem, and we can unpack this more in further discussion, but when you say the people wanted regime change, as you know better than anyone, that's part of the problem, is that there isn't really such a thing as the people. And when you remove that repressive regime, as horrible as it is, what you're really doing is putting the country up for grabs. And this is particularly challenging in countries that are so deeply divided internally, often with artificial borders and with neighbors that are going to struggle over the future of the country rather than work together to try to put something more stable in place.
Thanks, Phil. We have over 100 people, 110 people on this call, so I know you have tons of questions. I remind our audience, please, and I have some questions here, please submit them on the Q&A function. I will be monitoring them and pitching them to Phil. And let me pitch a question from Jefferson Gastire. I hope that's a correct pronunciation. If you would reflect a bit, maybe this is not so much in your book, but the current realities of great power competition in the Middle East and all over the world, a major part of U.S. policy. You did mention, Obama's quote unquote, emphasis, pivot to Asia, all of that stuff. How much do you see this great power competition with China and Russia as, really the most important stuff that U.S. policy needs to focus on in the Middle East, and that pushes it towards a more sort of realist, less adventurous, let's say, foreign policy that we just have to sort of more like the Cold War days, count our chips and see who's with us and who's. Do you see a link between great power competition and the question of sort of political transformation more than, I think we all agree, regime change, as the U.S. has been attempting it, is A, illegal, B, not a great idea. But what are your reflections on the links there?
You're right. That's the new thing in American foreign policy, focused on great power competition, obviously rising China, but Russia adversarial, and we should abandon these lesser problems and focus on that. That's been a big theme in the Trump administration and elsewhere. That's not really my argument, though. Obviously, we need to deal with great powers, and particularly China is going to be the dominant issue of the next couple of decades. But I am not arguing, like some of those people, that the Middle East doesn't matter. There are some, in fact, increasing numbers, who take the view, especially with relative energy independence and the growing challenges in other parts of the world, we should just wash our hands of the Middle East. Can't do anything successful there anyway. Indeed, there's a strong element of that on both the right and the left. This forever war debate has a right wing and a left wing element. Trump himself constantly says, we've wasted trillions of dollars in the Middle East. We'd be better off if previous presidents had just played golf. It's just sand and we should get out. And that's mirrored on the left by those who say this is just American imperialism, interventionism, and we should get out of these wars. I don't think that, and that's not my argument. My argument about these regime change efforts is to underscore that when we are too ambitious, we fail to achieve our goals and sometimes even make things worse at great cost to us. And that, I suppose, is linked to the great power competition, because I think you could argue, and most Americans would agree, that if you had $1 trillion to devote to something, would it be to make us stronger at home, period, and vis-a-vis the other big challenges that we face? Or would it be the attempt to reconstruct and transform Iraq and Afghanistan, each of which has cost more than $1 trillion, not to mention the lives and all of that. So my argument about the Middle East is not that we don't have an interest or that it doesn't matter. It's that when we bite off more than we can chew, and are too ambitious about what we can accomplish, we end up going in the wrong direction at great cost to us and the people of the region, and with all sorts of unintended consequences. One thing, Paul, before you, because I failed to address the interesting Tunisia point you made. It's a separate point, but it is relevant in this context. One, I don't define that as regime change, regime change in the way I described it, because it wasn't U.S. policy. We didn't do Tunisia, the Tunisians did, but that's actually quite striking, and I just leave people to think about it. The fact that of all of the cases in the Middle East where there was relatively positive regime change that led to more stability and more democracy, it was in the one place that we had very little to do with. It wasn't US policy, and we just sort of let it happen on its own. There are other reasons for Tunisia's relative success, but it is quite striking that the lack of correlation between American involvement and relative success of the political transition.
Thanks. So let me ask you also two broad questions. One is about America. The United States is not very good at governance in the last 20, 30 years. I'm reading the latest book by Fareed Zakaria, and we were talking about this before we started. And he emphasizes, the degree to which, mainly since Ronald Reagan and his famous statement, government is not a solution to a problem, government is the problem. And when you look at the trajectory of the US federal government in the last 40 years, and you look at European governments, is a completely different, generally a very different, maybe Britain is somewhere in between, to the degree that you have a US today that cannot manage a pandemic. It's managing similar to a third world country, if not worse. It is completely divided. Its media has created competing factions who are building militias. The economy has created such inequality and high levels of what you would call political corruption. And you look at America's foreign policy, it invests tremendously in nation smashing, which is the military. You put trillions of dollars into taking down a country. And every president almost proudly says, well, I don't do nation building. I'm good at nation smashing, but we don't do that other thing. And regardless of, interventions and all of that is, putting that aside, you do look at Iraq, you do look at Libya, and obviously it's been said, and you address it in the book, that there was much put into the smashing and very little compared to what needed to be done, put into governance, what needs to happen the day after so people's lives continue. And this is also a question I think somebody put from the audience. Maybe the US is, empires have been doing this for years. Some of them are better at it than others. the U.S., went into Iraq and smashed the government and said, okay, we've given you freedom and elections and a free market. Good luck. And the country went down the tube. So how much of it is also a governance question from the U.S. side? Another big question, I'm sorry, they're two large questions, but comes up from the examples that the Middle East region, in the countries that are troubled, there is a lot of regional and international intervention. It's not just the US that intervened. In Iraq, obviously, Iran was there, and then other players. In Syria, everybody came in. Egypt, you had UAE and Saudi Arabia pushing in a different direction, and Turkey and Qatar. Tunisia was happily, off on its own, and nobody cared enough to intervene. So one of the reasons it wasn't maybe messed up. So maybe that my completely different second question is, how much is this failure due to the fact that one is attempting to evolve or change these regimes at a time when the region is tearing itself apart? And that's just very difficult to do.
Yeah, again, some big questions there. On governance, certainly the United States faces enormous problems at home. I would argue, you said in the past couple of decades, I think the past 4 years are better examples of governmental failure and incompetence than the previous couple of decades. Obviously, there were challenges before that, but we did okay handling potential pandemics, and the economy was doing pretty well. So for all of the challenges, I think it's really in the last 4 years that this incompetence has manifested itself in a greater way. But it's still a fair overall point. A country that faces enormous challenges at home does raise questions about our ability to export our system and impose stability abroad when we're struggling at home. And it is linked to this question of resources that I talk a lot about in the book as a challenge. The destroying the part that you mentioned is easy. We do have the military capacity to get rid of a government anyway. Sometimes it takes longer than people think. And Libya is a good example of that. It took 8 months of warfare before we toppled even the relatively weak Gaddafi regime. In Iraq, we had to send in hundreds of thousands of troops. And in Syria, there was a lot of fighting and the regime didn't fall. So people tend to underestimate how much military power it takes even to remove the regime, but we can do that. The harder part is what comes afterwards, and it's a combination of what you're getting at about this governance. We don't know a lot about the country, the challenges are enormous, but then resources. I think Iraq and Afghanistan both show that even with massive resources, some of these things are beyond our capacity. It's mind-boggling the degree to which we've devoted resources in those countries. In Iraq, and again, this is beyond the human costs, but in Iraq, the financial costs were over $100 billion a year for the first 10 years after the intervention. That, to translate it into something that crystallizes better in your head, is more than $300 million per day. So you have to be prepared to say, even if you want to say, the situation is so intolerable in that country that we have to change the regime, we don't have a choice. Understand that you then have to be willing to put in the resources to make it work afterwards, or you're going to just get a failure on your hand. And that, you put these things together, it doesn't appear that the American public is willing to devote those resources for the amount of time that they would have to make a success of this. And that, again, going back to your first question about who I wrote this book for, keep that in mind before the next time leaders try to persuade you, we can do this and it won't be that expensive. In my Iraq chapter, I go into great detail about those who argued before the Iraq intervention, not only how well it would work, but it wouldn't cost us very much at all. Iraq could be self-sustaining, they have oil, the neighbors who do the peacekeeping. And I go into that in great detail, not because it wasn't, people weren't aware of it, but it's healthy to, or even to score points about people who got it wrong. But it's healthy to remind yourself that that's the tendency and the pattern in these cases. Once people start making the case for these interventions and wars, they underplay the costs and they oversell the benefits. And to remind yourself of how we did that in Iraq, which we did in other cases as well, is really salutary and important to keep in mind. Just sort of last point on this resource thing to underscore the point. I also talk about some cases outside of the Middle East that are alleged successes in regime change. One that comes up periodically is Panama. And one of the arguments there is that, it worked because the Powell Doctrine, we not only got rid of the Noriega regime, we put in enough force to keep the peace afterwards. Well, that's fine. But if you scale Panama to Afghanistan population-wise, to do the similar amount of peacekeeping force, you need 500,000 soldiers. So if you want to make the case, we can do Afghanistan, but you just have to deploy 500,000, 600,000 soldiers more or less indefinitely, you have a much tougher sell on your hands.
On the regional
Yeah.
conflict issue as being very difficult.
Yeah, that's one of the things, in the conclusion of the book, I try to sum up, just why is this so hard? And unfortunately, there are a lot of reasons, some of which we've discussed about the security vacuum and nationalism leading people to reject outside powers as liberators. I could go on, but the one that you're asking about is really relevant too, which is that the neighbors, far from being helpful once we get rid of the regime, often act as spoilers. And like it's a double whammy. We often go into these thinking, well, we'll do the hard part of getting rid of the regime, but then our allies will help us do peacekeeping afterwards. And of course, there's a degree of that, especially, Europeans stepped up fairly significantly in Afghanistan and helped there, and a little bit in Iraq, although not much. But it's worse than the fact that allies don't do as much as we would like afterwards. And Libya is another famous example of that, where President Obama sort of counted on the Europeans to do the post-war peacekeeping, but they were nowhere to be found for a whole bunch of valid reasons. People don't support it publicly. There's security problem on the ground. They don't have the forces. So not only do allies not do enough, but to get at your question, neighbors have their own interests, which are not necessarily our interests. And especially, I described this phenomenon of these countries being up for grabs internally when you remove any institutions or structures. They're also up for grabs regionally. And again, I don't need to tell you about the region's divides, which are national divides: Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, different countries. There's sectarian divides between Sunni and Shia and the countries that are majority Sunni, majority Shia, especially Iran and some of its neighbors. But there are also divides within the Sunni majority countries, deep ones, I think, which is a factor that's underappreciated, between this block of countries like Egypt, UAE, and Saudi on one hand, and Qatar and Turkey and the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood and Hamas on the other. They also fight for control. And again, look at what's happening in Libya today. We got rid of the regime, but it's not just Libyans fighting among each other. It's the neighbors backing their respective proxies. And it's easier in these cases to thwart success than to succeed. So, we, to bring stability, have to, dominate the situation and put something in place. All they have to do is make it hard for us. So we do Afghanistan, and guess what? Pakistan has an interest in undermining our success there, or at least supporting their proxies and the Taliban, which makes it harder for us to succeed. In Iraq, this was widely predicted before we went in, Iran is on the ground. They have their Shia militia, they have their proxies, they have a big border. They care more than we do because it's their long-term future. And even the U.S. Army's own study of the Iraq War concluded that the only winner was Iran, and they managed to thwart our success. In Syria, this phenomenon was even more devastating. We thought we could help the opposition get rid of the Assad regime, but guess what? We weren't only up against the Assad regime. We were up against the Assad regime and Russia and Iran, which were determined not to let us succeed for different reasons, but deeply determined, to the point that Russia was willing to send in its own forces and fight because they are so hostile to regime change. So that's just another factor that, this would be hard enough if it were just a matter of us getting rid of a bad regime and trying to get the people in that country to create some political stability together. It's almost impossible to do when the neighbors are bound and determined to undermine you, and that they have more direct resources and care more about it over the long term than Americans do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Phil. Now I have a bunch of questions from the audience, so I will go to those questions and basically pitch them to you as they are, more or less. Ziba Mushawar asks, how do you see inaction? That can also be very harmful, both for long-term U.S. interests and for countries in question. Two recent examples, obviously Syria, and the silence, more or less, regarding the Iranian uprising in Iran during the Obama, administration's negotiations over the nuclear deal. So, inaction or not pushing for whether it's internal change or not everything has a cause.
Yeah.
So if you were to write a book about, leaving the regimes in place and really not doing, what's the other straw man, as it were? What are the arguments there?
No, that's an excellent question, and an entirely fair point, that in foreign policy, action has consequences and inaction has consequences. And the challenge, which is an enormous challenge, is to calculate which has greater costs and which has greater potential benefits. And I try to be careful and fair in the book, and not just, the easy thing to do would be just write, we did a bunch of stuff and it didn't work out very well, and therefore it's always wrong. But if you're honest about it, you have to appreciate that in every one of these cases, the regime in question was a horrible regime. It was threatening to its neighbors, and it was repressive to its people. So no tears shed over these regimes disappearing. And again, if you're honest, as I try to be in the book, you have to acknowledge that inaction has its costs as well. And living with or managing these situations also has costs, and people suffer. But the question is, under which circumstance do they suffer more? And that's where I think my argument becomes pretty powerful, is that in all of these cases, no matter why we did the regime change or no matter how we did the regime change, the outcomes in most cases were worse for most people than the inaction, while acknowledging that inaction has costs as well. So to pick up on the two specific examples that the questioner mentioned, Syria, would living with the Assad regime, which was horribly repressive and people were rightly rising up against it, or I should say understandably, would living with that regime have had costs for the people of Syria and for the United States and its neighbors? Yes, of course. And Syria would continue to be allied with Iran, and Assad regime would be corrupt and repressive. But you compare that to the costs of trying and failing, at least, to get rid of the regime, which led to an intense civil war, many hundreds of thousands killed, millions of displaced, undermining stability in neighboring countries like Lebanon. Again, Paul, I think a quarter of the population is now Syrian refugees, massive refugee camps in Jordan, millions in Turkey, overflow into Europe, fomenting populism, the conflict itself fomenting extremism and sectarianism, with foreign fighters rushing into Syria. I don't think there's any question but that situation was worse than inaction or nothing. And I think we do have to admit in Syria, and I say we collectively, it was in the United States, the neighboring regimes, a lot of people ended up almost in this worst of all worlds spot of fomenting and sustaining a conflict, but not succeeding in bringing about that transition. So there, I think it's pretty clear. Now, you can argue that really the alternative to what we did was to do more and intervene directly and use military force. And I take that on as well as part of this reminder that it always takes more force than you think. I gave you the example already that Libya, the most powerful alliance in the world, NATO intervenes and different countries are arming the opposition, and you had this decrepit Gaddafi regime with no allies and a military falling apart. And it still took 8 months of battles on the ground and in the cities to get the transition, which didn't end with a compromise agreement or Gaddafi leaving. It ended with him being pulled from a pipe in Sirte and killed, and then everybody fighting over the spoils. So if that was the case, if we took that in Libya, let's not pretend that a handful of airstrikes in Syria, whether in 2012 or over chemical weapons in 2013, would have led this regime to fall, a regime that was backed strongly by Russia and Iran. And then even if and when we did succeed, let's say in Syria, you say, well, you're right, halfway wasn't enough, we should have done more. We could have done whatever it took militarily to overthrow that regime, but then you're left with, okay, now what do you do? That you've destroyed everything that exists. In a revolutionary situation, often the most extreme will come to power. I used to say in Syria, after a couple of years down this road, when people would ask, if we get rid of Assad, what happens? I would say, and I think I couldn't tell you who would come to power. I could just tell you that it wasn't going to be the moderate elements of the opposition that we wanted to support. It would be more extreme ones, and then it's up to us. Do we go in and deal with them? It's an Iraq-like situation. So Syria, I think, underscores that the cost of inaction can actually be a lot less than the costs of action. And I won't do it in great detail, but just very briefly, because I know there are a lot of other questions. This questioner also brought up Iran and the inaction in 2009. That's like everybody's poster child for Obama's failure. And if he had only supported the opposition then, but people don't really finish that sentence. So what we're talking about here, just to be clear for everybody, is after contested and likely fraudulent elections in Iran in 2009, there were widespread protests on the streets. And the Obama administration and President Obama himself was reluctant to really get too far in front of that in standing by the protesters and calling for political transition, because he didn't want it to be about America. If the Iranians wanted to protest, more power to them, but he thought it could undermine them to have it be associated with the United States, and you can debate whether that's right or wrong. But I think he also appreciated what does that mean if we throw away the weight behind these protests and then the Iranian regime starts to crack down militarily? What is our responsibility there? I think he had in mind, we all remember after the first Gulf War in 1991, when President George H.W. Bush called on the Shia in the South to rise up against the dictator Saddam. But then when Saddam started massacring them, we weren't prepared to go and defend them. So I think that's also what Obama had in mind. If we start rallying and saying, we're behind the opposition, let's overthrow this horrible regime, and then the regime, as was likely, starts to massacre them, what do we do in that situation? So what I mean about not finishing the sentence is critics often say, if only Obama had stood up, then, well, what? Then do we think the Iranian regime would have said, well, the White House has made a very strong statement. We should maybe negotiate a political transition or not attack the protesters? I'm being a little bit facetious because I think it is a hard question to answer. What do you actually have in mind when you say Obama missed this chance to take action that would have, I'm not really sure what. So there too, I think inaction can be defended unless you're really prepared to do what it takes to make your action succeed.
Thanks, Phil. Let me go to a question from Manon Barteau. I don't know if that's a French name. I think it is. I hope I pronounced it correctly. Could Mr. Gordon elaborate about perspectives for U.S. involvement in Libya? He referred to the strong intervention based on responsibility to protect R2P, but then didn't the U.S. consider it Europe's backyard? Is this changing now that Russia has become more involved? So a question about Libya, but also, if I may, I want to add this dimension of R2P responsibility to protect and ask you your view about that. That obviously is a different thing than regime change. As you said, in Libya, it started as R2P and ended up with regime change. It was raised in Syria, again, as a separate issue, that we get it, that, overthrowing the regime is a different question. But there was, a lot of criticism to Obama of abandoning the global principle, which was beginning to be established, of R2P, responsibility to protect. And only when Assad used chemical weapons did Obama, or Trump for that matter, say, hey, wait a minute, you can kill people, but, use barrel bombs and other, traditional things. Just don't use chemical weapons. I mean, so one pivot point, I think, in the global order or disorder, which was implemented in Libya and abandoned in Syria, is the question of responsibility to protect. Does it matter to the US if a government is slaughtering its own people? I get it that regime change, politics, regional, it's complicated. But what do we do about that principle? Do we just say, well, nice idea, cannot be protected?
Yeah, so here's what I think. I mean, I'm sympathetic to the notion of responsibility to protect, and I'm sympathetic to the notion that we don't have to totally defer to sovereign governments about the way they treat their publics. But the problem with responsibility to protect is the suggestion or the notion that that's what's standing between us and saving lives, right? And I don't think it should. If we have a way to save lives when a government is horribly repressing or killing its people, then we shouldn't let even international law or the absence of responsibility to protect standing in the way. But the problem with the notion is if that implies that there is some effective way to save those people, and the only thing blocking us was this aversion to doing it because we didn't think we had some basis for doing so. In other words, it begs the question of how exactly do you go and save those lives, whether we're talking about Syria or Libya or Rwanda. And that's when it gets much harder. So what it does, it actually raises the question of how to do it rather than resolves that question.
Well, I mean, if I may, as an interjection, I mean, and it was a big debate under Obama with the no-fly zone idea, which was originally something, was implemented in Libya. It worked successfully for the Kurds back in 1991, I think, to protect them from Saddam's forces. And it was, debated and considered on the Obama administration. That would have had an impact. It would have been complicated. What are your thoughts? There is a way to protect from some of and it wasn't taken.
Yeah, there can be, and I acknowledge, I agree. There are cases where a no-fly zone can protect people without slipping into the risks of regime change. And you're right, the Kurds post-Iraq war is a good example of that. But you're also right to raise it in Syria, and I talk about this in great detail in the book, going through the Obama administration's reflection, because again, a lot of critics say, well, why didn't you at least do that? The issue was, and of course the Obama administration, the United States had the military power to stop the Syrian Air Force from flying. I think the logic train was that, again, a no-fly zone can prevent the regime from using combat aircraft to strafe civilians. But in the case of Syria, and a big difference with Iraq was the Kurds were all more or less in one zone. So you can say above this parallel, we're not going to let anybody fly. In Syria, the population is much more intermingled, and you have fighting going on within cities. So it's harder to just create this no-fly zone or safe zone. But then it also raises the question is, what is the next step? And that would be always the question posed in the Situation Room as the Obama administration deliberated what to do about Syria, and even a no-fly zone. So if, let's say, you can get around the challenges of, that would mean, a significant military deployments, a big country with a lot of advanced Russian air defenses. You'd have to take them out if you're going to do overflights in Syria. So you have to start by, essentially killing a number of people, Syrians and possibly Russian advisors. Okay, maybe you're willing to do that, but you have to strike the anti-aircraft and missile sites with whatever consequences comes with that. You can crater runways, but they can easily, resurface or repatch the runways. You can hit aircraft on the ground, but again, you'll kill people on the ground, and maybe that, comes with the territory. But then they turn to mostly helicopters and ground fire. And one of the things we were briefed on the Obama administration is that around 90% of those being killed in Syria were being killed by artillery, machine guns, ground conflict rather than by these airplanes, which again, don't get me wrong, were horrific, and the barrel bombs were horrific, and you can make a strong case that we should at least stop that. But you should not imagine for a minute that a no-fly zone stops the conflicts that was going on in Syria. It just would transform it for a bit. So we would then find ourselves, so we take out the air defenses, we do overflights. Syria is not flying its airplanes anymore, but they're using helicopters, artillery, Scuds, missiles, and troops to do the same sort of killing. So it's a little bit like what you sort of said about chemical weapons. So you're going to stop them from using chemicals, but you let them do barrel bombs. This would be, well, you're going to stop them from using airplanes, but you're going to let them do everything else. So then you'd be in this situation where you were preventing them from flying combat aircraft over Syria, but underneath your air cover, they would be strafing and maiming and killing, in Aleppo, for example. And it would quickly raise the next question, okay, what are you going to do about the helicopters and the missiles and the troops? And so either then you would just settle and say, well, we're not going to go down that road because that's a slippery slope to intervention or regime change. We're just going to keep the no-fly zone. That's possible, would have been sustainable, it would have been a little bit absurd, but it really wouldn't have resolved the problem of the conflict in Syria. You might say, well, without that air advantage, the opposition would be stronger and might have won. Then you get into two challenges. What we saw in Syria all along is whenever we strengthen the opposition vis-a-vis the regime reinforced itself with troops from Hezbollah, Russian forces, including eventually tanks and ships and aircraft. So then you get in the business, do you shoot down Russian aircraft? But then if you do that, even if you do it successfully, then you're strengthening the opposition and they start to take territory. And you run into the possibility of what is sometimes called catastrophic success, where then the regime does collapse because you've sufficiently weakened it, and you're back to this situation of free-for-all and civil conflict. I think it is legitimate to say, well, that would have been better than where we ended up, but I hope that gives a sense as to why it's not so simple to say, well, we could have stopped all of this if only we had just put up a no-fly zone. And it raises the question again, sorry, Paul, to get back to your core question, whom does that protect? You can say, all right, from now on, we're going to protect any Syrian opposition in this zone. And if the Syrian regime tries to attack that zone, then we will respond. But then, of course, that zone becomes part of the battlefield. And the regime legitimately believes that that is being set up not just to protect civilian lives, but to strengthen an opposition that's trying to violently overthrow them. So sometimes what sounds simple, well, we're just going to protect some civilian lives in this area, actually turns out not to be simple at all.
Thanks, Phil. I kind of hijacked Manon Barthol's question. If you could say a bit on Libya, the European, you were there in the White House and so on, how you perceived the, cooperation with Europe. Was it a European failure? I'm not pointing fingers. And
yeah.
The Russians are involved. You're not in the White House now, but how does that look from Washington to you? the Libya situation?
Yeah, I mean, Europe definitely played a major role in the Libyan intervention. And again, one of the episodes I describe in the book is how Europe led the way in persuading Obama to intervene in Libya. As I said, earlier on in our conversation, Obama was a reluctant intervener. This was not his thing. He didn't come to office planning to do regime change in North Africa. But with the situation in Benghazi, and the administration was divided, as I also described, it was a largely along generational lines, with the younger advisors saying, we have the responsibility to act, and more senior ones, including then Vice President Biden, Secretary of Defense Gates, more cautious and skeptical. And so in March 2011, I actually traveled, I was still at the State Department then doing Europe. I went with Secretary Clinton to a G8 foreign ministers meeting where the subject was Libya. What are you guys going to do? The Europeans wanted to know. And we didn't know because we didn't have a policy. Washington was still deliberated. So Secretary Clinton allowed the Europeans to speak first. And one after another, the French, British, Italian foreign ministers said, we need America to act. There are refugees coming out. Benghazi is at risk. And so that, I think, helped persuade Secretary Clinton to support the intervention, which she then did, and Obama agreed. But Obama agreed, again, not wanting to repeat the Iraq War, and certainly ground troops were not an option, given congressional and domestic opinion, that we would just provide unique capabilities at the start of the operation, and then Europe would be asked to do the bulk of the flying and help provide stability afterwards. Now, to their credit, the Europeans did a lot of the flying. In the no-fly zone, I think 75% of the strike sorties and aircraft were provided by Europeans. So they largely did that. But then again, war took a long time. When Gaddafi finally does fall, and it was a question of, okay, who's going to bring stability to Libya now? The United States wasn't prepared to put in ground troops. Even the most hawkish proponents of regime change didn't want to do that, and the Europeans had no appetite for it either. So in that sense, I think it's an example of Europe pushing the United States to intervene, but also not being prepared to do what was arguably necessary. And again, we don't even know if it would have worked to try to bring stability to Libya through outside forces. We do know that it was impossible to find the domestic forces. The Libyans, were too deeply divided, fragmented. They didn't want, by the way, it's important to understand, they didn't want outside peacekeepers. Libyans were determined they wanted to do this themselves. They didn't want NATO or US peacekeepers. And the result was, unfortunately, once again, the security vacuum that follows regime change.
Thank you, Phil. Let me go to a question from Sophia Besh. She asks, one pattern in the U.S. interventions had been what appears to be a naive optimism in Washington that the U.S. is the right power to help bring about change. This idea of America, city on a hill, we will bring democracy to the world, and so on.
Yeah.
And she, in the question, asks about the Democratic Party today. You've mentioned that, President Obama fought a battle within the Democratic Party about this, in a sense, saying, no more intervention, that, Hillary Clinton was for Iraq, and then he beat McCain. Important to note, Donald Trump sort of came on the same platform that it was, we should have never been there, and so on and so forth. But the question really is about the Democratic Party. We're facing an election. They might win. Where do you see the thinking in the Democratic Party today? And let me focus that a bit. When they, whoever they is, the Democratic Party today, look at the Middle East, I doubt there are many regime changers still amidst them. I think that that's fair to say. I guess I would ask, are there any democratizers still in there who believe, and this really relates to a broader question to your book. You're saying regime change, terrible, doesn't work. And yet, the overall assessment has been in the Middle East that the region needs change. It needs political change, evolution, generally towards better governance and democracy. The U.S. wants to be on the right, not only the right side of history, but encouraging that in the right way, not in the disastrous ways that you indicate. Is the Democratic Party, as you assess it, just giving up on the Middle East, as many authors that we know kind of written about, or just, manage the problems as best you can, but there's really no hope? Or do you see any dreamers still? What's your assessment there of those Democrats?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question on several levels with sort of two core parts to it. One is, going back to Sophia Besh's original question, what about America's particular role and America thinking it can do these things? That's definitely the history. I mean, when I go back 70 years, that's what's constant in all of this, is Americans believing that it's a very American strategic culture sort of thing. Every problem has a solution, and if we put enough of American power to it, we can find that solution and deliver. And that derives from America's history of accomplishing great things, sometimes including with military power. And it leads them, or I should say has led them, because we'll get to where we are now, to always be susceptible to this notion, we can do it, can-do spirit, and we'll deliver. You'd think at a certain point we'd start to realize that maybe that's beyond our control. And again, that's one of the ironies of Obama, who kind of gets elected with that realist, more Scowcroftian perspective that that's beyond our ability, but then finds himself trying to do it as well. That is what has led us to bite off what more than we can chew in so many of these cases. Where does that leave us now? I think the appetite is clearly declining in both parties. I mean, Trump was already a manifestation on the right of, there were plenty of hawks and interveners who ran against him in 2016 primaries, and they got swept aside. So definitely on that side of the spectrum, there is real skepticism. On the Democratic side, is interesting. The appetite is arguably even less. This notion of forever wars, which Trump talks about all the time, ending endless wars. Well, the very Democratic Party platform has a whole section on ending forever wars. So there does seem to be a consensus that we don't want to devote too many resources anymore to this region. I mean, prominent Democrats, there was a piece by Martin Indyk in the Wall Street Journal and a piece by Tamara Wittes and Mara Karlin in Foreign Affairs, suggesting that the Middle East isn't as important to us as it used to be, and hinting that therefore we should start devoting our resources elsewhere. So I think that does reflect tendency. It's a bipartisan tendency. Interestingly, I'll sort of end with this thought, even though I've just written a book warning against overreach in the Middle East, if anything within the Democratic Party, I think I'm going to find myself having to push in the other direction of saying, but it still matters and there's still things we can do. I mean, the risk is that we overreach in the opposite direction and people just want to wash their hands of it. So yes, I do think there are still Democrats who believe we have interests in the region and should be supporting democracy and human rights. But the greater risk, I think, is overreach, where people just get so fed up of failure in the region that they want to just wash their hands of it entirely. And I'm not among those who think we have no interest in the Middle East. I think, and that's where my book ends, is that to say that you can't successfully overthrow regimes and transform these societies doesn't mean there's nothing you can and should do. And instead, some combination of diplomacy and deterrence and engagement and arms control is just a better way to pursue our interests in the long term than the quick fix of regime overthrow.
Mm-hmm. We are out of time or almost out of time, depends how we interpret it. We still have a ton of questions. Obviously, we're not going to get to them, and my apologies for that. But let me end with integrating 3 questioners and making that the last. I'm going to take elements of questions from Phyllis Bennis, Stephen Humphreys, and Ambassador David Mack. Phyllis asks, if you could reflect on, and this relates to something Stephen asked as well, the invasion of Afghanistan was a result of 9/11, and that the government in the Taliban in Afghanistan refused to move against Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. So while obviously it's been a total disaster and mess, realistically, after 9/11 and after the Taliban government's decision, was there an actual alternative? So there's the reality aspect. Phyllis Bennis asks, those who decided to go to Iraq, not you, and not Obama and whatnot, maybe the last thing on their mind was, okay, we're going to bring good governance and democracy. It was about geopolitics, maybe energy, oil, containing Iran, and hence, and from the Israeli side, removing the Iraqi army, which was the biggest threat to them, and now it's the Iranian army. So from that geopolitical perspective of those who did it, maybe, okay, fine, it turned out to be a mess, but they did some of the things they wanted to do. That's a question, kind of, how do you assess those darker motives of America's geopolitical movements? And to end on a sort of a more hopeful note from Ambassador Mack, why don't we at least embrace the successful regime changes more vigorously? And here the example is Tunisia. They did it themselves. The U.S. has not, made a big point of staying, helping Tunisia. They've helped, but they've not made it the big success story along with the Europeans and maybe others that the U.S. could have done. So at least stand with the success stories more vigorously. That's a multi-part question, but it does end our discussion. So over to you, Phil, for some quick responses.
Thanks, Paul. Again, those are all great questions, and yes, we could easily take another hour or two, but that's a good sign that these are that there's a lot of interest in these important issues. So very briefly, Afghanistan, and the questioner is right to bring up alternatives. And like I said in the book, I try to be honest and not just say that the course of action pursued was bad, but what the realistic alternatives were. And Afghanistan post 9/11 is one of those that's most challenging, that's hardest to argue that we shouldn't have done regime change. Al-Qaeda attacks the United States, the Taliban refuses to give them up. It's hard to argue that we shouldn't, in that case, overthrow the Taliban. And by the way, I don't. I do note, though, that, and at the time was widely supported, right? I mean, the authorization of the use of military force, there was only one vote in Congress against it, American public 80, 90%. But even there, if Americans were told at that moment that, so we need to do this, right? But by the way, 20 years later, we're still going to be there. We'll have spent $1 trillion, lost several thousand lives. The Afghan government would still be deeply divided and corrupt, and the Taliban would hold large parts of the country and be poised potentially to return, because after all of this, we're still not able to put something better in place. That would be a much tougher sell. And that's why, for me, even if you make the case, Afghanistan 9/11 was necessary to do regime change, it's not difficult to make a case that having done so, we should have had much less ambitious aims rather than try to put in hundreds of thousands of troops and transform the country, a project at which we've essentially failed. We don't really have time to do it here, but I'll just flag very briefly that what's really interesting about the Afghan cases is that they seem so obvious as positive cases for the reasons just said about post 9/11. In the 80s is often seen as the example of how regime change does work. I mean, in the CIA and elsewhere, this is looked back on as the model, right? It didn't cost very much money. We didn't lose any American troops. And we got rid of the Soviet Union. But there too, if you actually think about, so we did that, but it led to a decade of savage civil war, the Taliban ultimately coming into power, harboring Al-Qaeda, attacks the United States, and then all the consequences that flow from that, global jihadism and so on. Even this model of how to do regime change in the 80s in Afghanistan doesn't look so impressive. Iraq, democracy and all that, again, massive topic we don't really have time for here. Paul Wolfowitz famously said that we focused on weapons of mass destruction for sort of bureaucratic reasons. It was the only thing that we could get everybody to agree on. But there were a lot of other motivations for intervening in Iraq, and democracy became a pivotal one. I do think it was important because I do think the Bush administration was sold on the notion, if we can just do democracy in Iraq, that spills over elsewhere. And we can solve our overall Middle Eastern problem of terrorism, because terrorism derives from these autocratic regimes repressing the people. They turn to terrorism. So we do democracy in Iraq, it spreads elsewhere, we solve that core problem. The problem with that wasn't the logic, because it's true, if we managed to put a liberal democracy in Iraq, it probably would have had a positive spillover effect, and that would have lessened terrorism. The problem was our ability to do it. And that's the manifest failure in Iraq. And so on that, I'll just conclude by saying, this gets me back to the purpose of the book and what people need to keep in mind. If a US government says, look, we just need to do this because the threat is so great, fine, debate it and reach that conclusion. But if they say we're going to do it because it's going to then lead to democracy in the country and that's going to spread around the region, be very, very skeptical. And then finally, and I welcome Ambassador Mack's invitation to end on a positive note, we should be doing that. Tunisia is a great example. Again, there are other reasons why Tunisia succeeded, rather than say Libya or Syria. But we should be supportive to that sort of transition. It does show that it's possible in an Arab country, in a Muslim country, to bring people together, to move in a semi-transparent, liberal, democratic direction. And as I said earlier, it's quite notable that this example of the greatest success is also an example of a place that we had nothing to do with and that we didn't use our power to overthrow the regime.
Thanks, Phil, and thanks to everybody who's been on this call. Sorry we couldn't get to everybody's questions. Our team will download these questions, and Phil, if we may, we will send an email to you. Maybe you can respond to a few. Thanks, Phil, for taking the time to be with us in this audience today. You heard the webinar. Now buy the book. I didn't buy the book. Phil sent me a free copy, so that's I got a freebie. But very important topic. Thanks everybody for being with us. Thanks, Phil, for taking the time. Thanks to the MEI team for putting this all together. See you soon, I hope. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Thanks, Paul, and everybody.